In 2014, something happened that shocked the world.
Nigeria is ramping up its search for more than 100 missing girls after militants attacked their school last Monday. The president has called the situation a national disaster.
276 schoolgirls were kidnapped from their school in Chibok, Nigeria, by an Islamic terrorist group called Boko Haram. The world was outraged. It is still hard to forget the stories of those girls and the pain of their families. While the attention of mass media switched away from these victims of Boko Haram, the group hasn't gone away. Just last month, on February 19th, they abducted another 110 girls from another school, this time in Dapchi.
While most people in the United States have heard of Boko Haram, the information provided by the media is often limited to 3 messages. 1. The Boko Haram is an Islamic terrorist group and classified as such by the United States government. 2. They fight for an absolute Islamic regime. And 3. They are a violent organization and they are funded by and work with other violent religious terrorist groups around the world, like Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
In this piece, we look deeper than these aspects of Boko Haram, farther than the surface information we get from mass media. We ask more complex questions. What is Nigeria's history of radicalization? What have been the economic conditions that have led to these extremist movements? Where does colonization fit into the picture? We also take a look at government's responses to Boko Haram, and even some movements happening in Nigeria to combat the violence.
Our first interviewee, Dr. Elton Tawi, is a professor of comparative religion and Islamic studies at the Evergreen State College in Washington State.
My name is Sarah Elton Tawi. I teach comparative religion here at Evergreen.
She's also a research scholar at the Middle East Center of the University of Washington. Dr. Elton Tawi's recent book, Sharia on Trial, Northern Nigeria's Islamic Revolution, was written on the 1999 riots in northern Nigeria to re-implement Sharia law, so she has a ton of helpful information and perspective about Nigeria's more recent history of radicalization. Next, we talk to Dr. Lunat, a professor of political science and philosophy at Skagit Valley Community College. Dr. Lunat graduated from Vanderbilt University with a PhD in political science. Her specialty is on the more philosophical side of radicalization and Islam.
Before we dive in, we'll start with some important baseline information about Boko Haram. They were founded in 2002 by a man named Yusuf Muhammad. Although a rough translation of Boko Haram is that any non-Islamic education is sin, their main ideology is that any Western institution is sinful and must be eradicated, not just education. The goals of the group have changed over the years, but their main objective has been to implement a strict form of Sharia or Islamic law in Nigeria.
Put simply, Boko Haram can be seen as the Al-Qaeda of Nigeria. They try to promote their brand of extremist Islam through both violence and political control of the country, and are in fact supported by global terrorist networks. They've used a scorched earth policy to push their ideology. This means they work to destroy everything in their path that may be of use to their enemy. This means invading, bombing, burning, kidnapping, and murdering those who disagree with them.
Boko Haram is a unique and deadly hybrid between social movement and militant organization. They're a half-religious movement advocating for their followers to support an extremist brand of Islam, and half-violent group hell-bent on killing as many of their opponents as possible, no matter their religion. Although Boko Haram has existed since 2002, the battle against them ramped up in 2014 after they increased their terrorist operations with political and financial support from ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The fight against Boko Haram continues today, but much progress has been made in combating them by both Nigerian and foreign governments.
In order to understand the motives behind the Boko Haram, it is vital to first understand the country's colonial history. The British government first came to Nigeria in 1884. Their control expanded when oil companies set up treaties with rulers in the north, and by 1900, Britain had complete control over Nigeria. During this colonization, the British government intentionally created education and wealth gaps between the Nigerian people. They only offered education to a group of people they called the elite. These people were located in the south. This created class and poverty divisions amongst the people. This is the root of the disdain towards Western education, which was often taught by Christian missionaries. The aim of colonial education, particularly in northern Nigeria, was to maintain the existing status quo by imparting some literacy to their chosen elite class and prohibiting education for the commoner class. Boko Haram looks to this gap as a way to recruit members. They offer the impoverished Nigerians an alternative form of schooling. However, the material is based from Boko Haram's interpretation of the Quran and like-minded ideas. Although their group has been globally known as a terrorist organization, their struggles parallel with that of most social movements fighting anti-globalization and colonization. Furthermore, the ultimate goal for Boko Haram is to form an alternative system than the unequal one left behind by the British.
With this history of European colonization in mind, we'll now look at Nigeria's history of radicalization. Islam has been in Nigeria since the 12th century. Christianity was imposed by the British in Nigeria in the 17th century. As religions brought through colonization began to mix within the country, different forms of Islam were created. Since then, there have been multiple movements to implement a more pure form of Islam. Knowledge of these movements can help us understand how inequality and corruption have bred radical movements in Nigeria. One of these radical movements was led by Usman Dan Fodio in the 1700s. Fodio believed it was impossible to practice Islam purely in a non-Islamic setting. As his movement grew, the leaders of it became corrupt. This led to revolt slower down, and the movement collapsed. As we continue to look at radical movements, the issue of corruption comes up more. Another movement arose around the 1980s, called the Maitatsine religious riots. During the 1970s, industrialization took jobs away from other sectors, resulting in unemployment and increased inequality. As poor people became frustrated, along came a charismatic leader to the rescue, Muhammadu Marwa, or Maitatsine. Marwa condemned the rich Muslims and gave the poor a way out of poverty, Quranic teaching. Maitatsine said that to follow his teaching would mean social and economic justice for all Muslims. Western influence was to blame for inequality, and the solution was to implement a strict Islamic state. This rhetoric attracted many poor young men, most of whom had lost their jobs due to industrialization. The movement became violent in December of 1980 when a riot broke out. By the time the movement was over, it's estimated that about 4,200 people had been killed. Around this time, more than just violent radicals were asking for the implementation of Sharia law. A movement to bid for a national Sharia court of appeal happened, and although it failed, northern states began to implement Sharia law. This raised the expectation among Muslims that their socioeconomic conditions would be raised, but that wasn't the case. When the Islamic utopia many had in mind did not materialize, people got angry, and instead of directing their frustration towards Sharia law, they directed it toward Muslim elites. And this is where Boko Haram comes in.
Northern Nigerians took to the streets to demand the reimplementation of Islamic law starting in 1999. And many of those people cited the British colonial legacy of having disrupted Islamic law. So what happened starting in 1999 was that northern Nigerian states started implementing full Sharia penal codes. Those that kind of ultimately didn't work. They were too reductionist. They were too kind of hastily implemented. Also, the state of Nigeria in many ways is failing. The Corruption Perceptions Index ranked Nigeria the second most corrupt country in the world, economically and politically. Once that experiment with Sharia didn't work, many theorists that I find most convincing locate the rise of Boko Haram in that moment.
So what is the common denominator in all of these radical movements? Fodios in the 1700s and the Maitatsine riots in the 80s, as well as Boko Haram? Economic inequality. Each movement follows the same basic outline. Inequality increases until it reaches a crescendo of widespread poverty. People are frustrated. They're desperate. Then, just in time, a charismatic leader comes along. He preaches an extreme ideology and says it will solve everyone's economic problems. People flock to him, and before we know it, violence breaks out. This isn't to say that the brutality in these movements is justified. It is horrific, and no one should ever have to experience what the victims of their violence are put through. But our point is that there's a pattern of real material grievances that these radicalized people have. Dr. Lunat had something to say on this.
In the case of any terrorist group, there are oftentimes legitimate material claims. Either they are looking for their land back, or they're looking for non-interference by so-and-so or such and such. But then there may be some places where there are no safety nets in the community, right? And so my sense is the desperation there would perhaps lead to violence in a way that is not necessary in a country like the United States, where those safety nets still to some extent exist. I think it would behoove us to have a deeper understanding of, well, what is the history of the problem that these groups formed to address? What are the actual grievances, right?
So, with this idea of inequality leading to radicalization in mind, we'll now take a look at Nigeria's current economy. This will help us understand the rise of Boko Haram.
If you do a quick Google search of Nigeria's economy, it seems that the country is doing quite well. Their GDP is high and is shooting up. But this does not accurately represent how the majority of Nigerian people live. Widespread corruption in Nigeria has contributed significantly to economic inequality. Nigeria often ranks high on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, which measures corruption in different countries around the world. Between 1999 and 2007, the organization Human Rights Watch asserts that Nigeria lost between $4 billion and $8 billion yearly due to corruption. And this corruption has been found at all levels of government, from local officials taking bribes to federal officials embezzling funds. Inequality and poverty rates are high as well. Many citizens, especially those in the north where poverty rates are higher, struggle with access to basic needs and rights, like water and education.
So, although at first glance, Nigeria's economy seems to be doing well, the people are not. When we connect these factors of the economy to the country's history of colonization, we can see how much European powers are responsible for this inequality and corruption. Like we discussed earlier, European powers created intentional divisions between the people of Nigeria. They did this in a few ways. Corruption requires a complex monetary economy with different conflicting interests. African economies before European arrival were not this complex. So just through the nature of bringing European economies to Africa, this creates the possibility of corruption. The clearest strategy by European powers leading to inequality and corruption was to divide and conquer. This was done in a few ways. One way is colonizers favoring certain groups over others and giving them more privileges. This fostered class divisions and competition between groups of people. Another way this was done was through something called the hut tax. Settlers needed cheap labor, so in order to get that, they imposed taxes upon African people. This created forced incentive for people to work, because they needed to make money to pay their taxes. In order to collect taxes, settlers either chose to establish leaders or appointed their own. These appointed tax collectors were rewarded with more private property, increasing inequality. This also led to an accumulation of wealth to a small percentage of the population. As these leaders lost touch with the plights of their communities, they began abusing their power and taking bribes. Other authority figures were also appointed by settlers. They had different tasks, but they were all there for one reason: to make the colonized obedient. And these institutions aren't something that you can change in decolonization. Police and military, as well as government in Nigeria, all have this culture of oppression internalized, and it clearly continues today. Seeing this history makes it very clear how colonization was and is related to inequality and corruption in Nigeria.
We've examined the systemic and historical context of Boko Haram. Their violence is tied closely to colonization, corruption, and inequality. So what are the responses? What is actually being done now about the problem? In response to 2014 kidnappings of the Chibok schoolgirls, the Obama administration sent in military personnel, humanitarian aid, and legal advisors to assist the Nigerian government. They also began expanded intelligence sharing with the Nigerian government. In 2013 and 14, the group was deemed an official terrorist group by both the United States and the United Nations, which allows both governments to fully attack and prosecute members. More recently, the Trump administration has sold the Nigerian government high-tech aircraft and weaponry to fight Boko Haram, as well as expanded a military presence throughout Nigeria. The Nigerian government has also launched an extended military attack against Boko Haram, although they have been universally criticized for not doing enough in this matter. They have made incremental progress in using their own military to keep Boko Haram attacks at bay, but even after over a decade of fighting the group, they have failed to stop it from expanding and growing in power. Even though the government has declared a state of emergency and imposed a form of martial law in some areas of the country, it has not done much to stymie attacks and kidnappings. However, an internal conflict between one of the leaders of Boko Haram and their financial and political backers in ISIS and Al-Qaeda has led to a decrease in aggression lately from the terrorist group.
So, people are doing things about Boko Haram's violence. The Nigerian and U.S. governments are both using military force to fight them. The people of Nigeria are working against them and against the harmful psychological impacts of their violence. But Boko Haram is still around. They're still abducting women. They're still manipulating children into horrific acts. And they're still killing thousands of people. So why hasn't anything worked? What could we do differently? Both Dr. El-Tantawi and Dr. Lunat had some big ideas on this topic. First, Dr. El-Tantawi.
I think we like to think sometimes, and it's a form, I think, of intellectual laziness, to think the Boko Haram or those Nigerians over there, they're just fanatics. You know, their religion teaches them terrorism, and they just act this way because of these, phantasmorphic stories that they believe, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's just, what can we do? That's what they believe. No, it's not. That's not the answer. With our environmental situation looking the way it is, with water scarcity really starting to hit major cities of the world, it's just about time that we stop demonizing other people and realize that we need to share resources, figure out how to think globally, because so much of the conflict in Nigeria is really about resources as well. Oil, water, self-determination. So we need to change, our overall attitude toward other people.
So we need to see each other as humans. We need to look farther than the violence and address the systemic issues that are leading to it. Dr. Lunat had some more to say along these lines.
It seems to me that you cannot vilify someone, right? And you can't bomb an ideology out of existence. You can bomb people, you can kill people. You cannot kill ideology. And the ideological battle is one that cannot be, I think, fought with guns. That one has to be fought ideologically. And I think what would be required there is putting much more funding into education, allow people to entertain competing ideas, alternative ideas. If you teach people to think critically, you attend to those things that I think are far more on the level of social, economic policy and so on. I'm not saying it's going to get rid of terrorism, but to my mind, it will weaken the worst excesses of what those groups can do.
So this is an ideological battle, and it needs to be treated as such. We can't continue to throw our ideology at a group of people who think differently than us. That doesn't work. We need to fight their ideology with education and critical thinking. Boko Haram is still an issue. It's 2018, and they've been fighting since 2002. That's 16 years of violence. 16 years of kidnappings, suicide bombings, and assassinations. While it's easy to get lost and feeling hopeless about this situation, there are alternatives. If we look at the historical context, we can identify the problems with how Boko Haram is being addressed. We see that this is not a group that has materialized out of thin air. It's something that has come from a long history of oppression and inequality. The violence is not okay, but Boko Haram is a social movement, and every social movement has its history and its reasons. Until we identify these, it's impossible to truly stop their ideology. But once we do, we are a huge step closer to solving the problem.